Gracias a todos por...
If you could all please take your seats.
We will start our meeting, please. Thank you very much. Y empezamos la sesión de...
We will start this afternoon by looking at the situation of human rights in Ethiopia, in particular the case of Mr. Andargaቸው. The session on Ethiopia follows the delegation to Ethiopia in July of 2013 when we visited the African Union as well as the Ethiopian authorities. Since then, there have been events which are of great concern to us, which have to do with the, to all appearances, strange detention of Mr. Tsege, as well as various other bloggers from Zone 9. And we need to assess this situation. We have the Embassy of Ethiopia represented as well, the European External Action Services and the Commission Council. And we will try to get an idea of what exactly the situation is and see if we can make any progress. One of the aims of this subcommittee is freedom of expression, freedom to assembly and human rights. I met with the Ethiopian ambassador and I listened very carefully to all of the information he gave me, including the huge progress made by Ethiopia in the path to democracy over the last 20 years, and in particular their progress in economic development and fight against poverty. We also had the opportunity, however, to say that there's no particular order to all of this, that one of these comes before the others. Everything needs to go at the same time, and the ambassador fully agreed with us and was willing to provide us with information we wanted, and we have a representative from the embassy with us today. We have various speakers for this point. First of all, we have Mrs. Foa, who is the strategic director for the death penalty team in the Reprieve NGO. I'll give her the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about this important case. We've been working on Andargaço's case for a number of months now, 3 months since his abduction in Yemen in June of this year. Andargaço is a British national who would ordinarily reside in London with his partner and their 3 children. He's got twins and an older daughter. On the 23rd of June 2014, he was seized by a group of men while transiting through Sana'a International Airport, Yemen. He had been travelling from the United Arab Emirates to Eritrea entirely legitimately. His whereabouts were unknown to the family and indeed to the British government for a full 2 weeks, until on the 7th of July, the Ethiopian government confirmed that he was being held in their custody after having been placed on a plane and rendered to Ethiopia on the day that he was seized. All of this, we believe, in flagrant violation of international law. Since that date, Andargaço has been held in incommunicado detention at a location which the Ethiopian government has not disclosed to the British government or to Andargaço's family. He's had one brief meeting with an ambassador, but has been continually denied his right to consular access, as well as his right to legal counsel or independent medical treatment. He is currently held under sentence of death imposed in absentia in 2009 via a trial which there are grave concerns about the fairness and justice of that original trial. There's a bit more on this later, but I will see if I have time to speak about it. The Ethiopian government has not provided any firm assurances that the death sentence will not be carried out, despite requests from the Brits and other entities. We and Andy's family are, of course, extremely concerned for his welfare, and in particular, a risk of mistreatment that he faces in detention. There has been documentation of the use of torture by the Ethiopian regime against political prisoners in particular. In July, 2 videos of Andargacho being interrogated in detention were aired on Ethiopian state-owned television. Both appeared heavily edited. A British psychiatric expert has assessed the 2 videos and has expressed concern about a serious deterioration in the mental state of the individual, which appears to have occurred between the first and the second video. In the expert's opinion, trauma inflicted in detention is the likely cause of this marked deterioration, with Andargacho displaying a number of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is, we know, a common corollary of torture. We don't actually know what's happening to him in detention, and these are all speculations, and we don't know because we have not been granted access. He has been and continues to be a victim of kidnap, unlawful incommunicado detention, and possible mistreatment. He is also being held under unlawful sentence of death imposed in his absence. Reprieve has been working with the British government on this case to press for Andargacho to be released and returned to his family in the UK as a matter of the utmost priority. However, as I've said, the Ethiopian regime has refused to acknowledge that their crimes have been committed here against this individual. They have refused to acknowledge the UK's request that they respect his basic rights under international law, his right to consular access, his right to legal representation, and his right to independent medical treatment. He remains, therefore, in an incredibly perilous position, held at an unknown location for over 3 months, his family in the UK having no idea of his whereabouts or his mental and physical health. There are questions about why he was kidnapped and why he is now being captured and held in Ethiopia. He was and is a leading member of the ግንቦት 7, which is an opposition party in Ethiopia. The party has repeatedly called for democracy, free elections and civil rights in Ethiopia. Andargacho, along with dozens of other political activists, journalists, academics and civil society members, has been the victim previously of intense political oppression by the ruling Ethiopian regime. There has been a clear acceleration of this activity in the run-up to the country's general elections in 2015. Dozens have been arrested and tried on spurious politically motivated offences. There have recently been reports by the UN Special Rapporteurs, including the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association, Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom of Opinion on the current situation in Ethiopia, and they have asked that, they have called upon the government of Ethiopia to free all persons, like Andy, detained arbitrarily under the pretext of countering terrorism. The experts ask to let journalists, human rights defenders, political opponents and religious leaders carry out their legitimate work without fear of intimidation and incarceration. Andy was tried in absentia in 2009 alongside some 36 others on ill-defined politically motivated terrorism charges under Ethiopia's widely criticised anti-terrorism proclamation. All were found guilty and a number, including Andargacho, was sentenced to death. He was not formally notified of the trial against him taking place and was not given opportunity to present evidence in his defence. He is now held in an extremely vulnerable situation. He is under sentence of death, and we believe illegal acts have been and continue to be perpetrated against him, and we would ask that all efforts be made to have him released back to freedom and to his family in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tienen un statement que hemos repartido.
There is a statement from the British government that we've distributed. I believe you have it in front of you, where the British government confirms what Mrs. Farr has just said and bitterly complain that they do not have access to the prisoner. They don't have consular access to him, They don't have information about the detention and, in fact, the extradition. You can read that in your folders. And Mrs. Gomez has asked for the floor. I don't know whether you want to come in on this point or, and Mr. Howitt as well, or do you prefer for us to finish the presentations first? Mr. Howitt, please.
I think the other presentation is extremely important, but I'm extremely grateful that you've allowed me just to say, as a British national and a British member of the European Parliament, I think it's just important that we welcome what you said at the committee, to note that we've received a statement from the British Foreign Office, and I'm sure the President, when she sums up the debate at the end, will give our full backing to representations from the European Parliament to back up what the British Foreign Office has done. You know, sadly, adding further comment probably wouldn't add to what you've already said, but I did want Ms. Furr to be aware that we are listening to her and we are fully backing her position, and I'm sure, President, you will make that conclusion yourself.
Thank you very much. Ahora voy a dar la palabra.
Now I'll give the floor to Mrs. Emma Achille, who is head of the European Office on Frontline Defenders, will tell us about the arrest of the Zone 9 bloggers. You have the floor, madam.
Muchas gracias. Dear Chair members, thank you for inviting Frontline Defenders to speak in front of your subcommittee. Frontline is an organisation who works to provide fast and effective action to help protect human rights defenders at risk so that they can continue their work as key agents of social change. One of our areas of focus is digital security, where we assist human rights defenders to ensure that their communications are safe, among others. And so this has a specific link to the case of the Zone 9 bloggers. On the 17th of July, Ethiopian authorities formally charged 10 human rights defenders and bloggers under the widely criticised, as my colleague mentioned, 2009 anti-terrorism legislation. 7 of those charged are members of Zone 9, while 3 others are independent journalists. They are now in prison, and the next hearing in court on this case is expected on October the 15th. Zone 9 is a group of bloggers and human rights defenders who discuss online issues of public interest in Ethiopia. We are very concerned by the fact that defenders doing legitimate work in defence of human rights are targeted in an attempt to silence any independent voices talking about the human rights situation in the country. We believe, after analysing the case and the charges brought against the bloggers, that the authorities are deliberately using fabricated charges, such as connections with terrorist organisations, in this case the groups Jinbot 7 and the Oromo Liberation Front, which have been labelled as such, and other charges such as attempts to destabilise the nation, for which the accused could even incur the death penalty. Part of the supposed evidence is also that the human rights defenders used a package called Security in a Box, which is publicly available on the internet. We know about this package because we have developed it ourselves to meet the digital security and privacy needs of advocates and human rights defenders to enable them to communicate securely online. The content of Security in a Box is entirely legitimate. The software is available for free, and its use is entirely consistent with international human rights law. The Ethiopian authorities, we believe, have falsely suggested that the use of this software is evidence of inciting violence or seeking to overthrow the government, just by the pure fact of its use. In Ethiopia, human rights defenders work in extremely difficult conditions, marked by threats, acts of intimidation, restrictions on freedom of expression, association and assembly, judicial harassment and arbitrary arrests. Repressive legislation in recent years has been successful in silencing civil society. Several human rights defenders and journalists have been forced to flee the country, and those who remain practice self-censorship for fear of attack or harassment. Ever since the Ethiopian authorities decided to formally charge the Zone 9 bloggers, several independent journalists, which are now virtually the only independent voices that remain in the country, have received direct threats, and many have been forced to flee the country. during the month of August alone, up to 14 journalists from well-known news outlets have sought political asylum in Kenya. Ethiopia imposes severe restrictions on the internet and on digital communications. It is the only country in sub-Saharan Africa to implement nationwide internet filtering, according to Freedom House. The authorities persistently deny engaging in online censorship, but independent tests conducted by the OpenNet Initiative and by Freedom House indicate that the Ethiopian government imposes politically motivated internet filtering and monitoring on all users. In addition to increasing online censorship, politically objectionable content has been targeted for removal, often by way of threats from security officials who personally seek out users and bloggers to instruct them to take down certain content. Individual Facebook pages have also been selectively blocked by the government. The government's ability to monitor online activity and intercept digital communication has become quite sophisticated, and this is with the assistance from the Chinese government. So in conclusion, Frontline welcomes the statement released last week by the group of the UN rapporteurs and agrees with their call for release. We also welcome the local EU statement made on the 30th of July, where the EU ambassadors express concern with the developments about the bloggers and ask the Ethiopian authorities to ensure that the trial will be held according to international standards, that defenders have access to legal counsel and to their family, that they have the right to apply for bail, and that the trial is transparent and free from political interference. So we would like to take advantage of this opportunity to ask whether the EU has followed up on this case and what it plans to do on it in the weeks to come. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank you very much, Mrs. Akili. I'll be giving the floor now to Mrs. Garcia Guillen from the Ethiopian desk in the EAS. Thank you. You have the floor.
Yes, pero le pasaré la palabra.
Thank you, but I'll give the floor to my director. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for giving us the floor. My name is Dietmar Krissler. I'm the Deputy Head of Division in the External Action Service, East Africa Division. Madam Chair, the EAS follows very closely the human rights situation in Ethiopia. And in the past month, we have indeed witnessed developments, worrying developments, including the arrests of bloggers, journalists, members of the Ethiopian opposition, to which Emma has just alluded to. The situation requires attention, in particular in the context of the upcoming elections in Ethiopia in May next year. The EU delegation in Addis Ababa is closely monitoring these events, these developments, and in particular the court proceedings related to those cases of following the arrests. We have repeatedly highlighted the need to create space for genuine political dialogue in Ethiopia, as well as to guarantee the freedom of expression and association. We have concerns with regard to the anti-terrorism proclamation and the Charities and Societies proclamation, which restrict the activities of opposition parties and journalists and those of civil society organizations. The External Action Service has published a statement on the 6th of May expressing concern and calling on the authorities to ensure that in the case of the arrested journalists and bloggers, proceedings are carried out according to Ethiopian law and respecting international norms. In addition, and I'm grateful to Emma, she mentioned that also the EU heads of mission in Addis Ababa have released a statement on the 30th of July expressing concern regarding the arrests of the members of registered political parties. We repeatedly raised these issues, Madam Chair, with the Ethiopian authorities in the context of our Article 8 dialogues with the Ethiopian government, including at the highest level. We have regular meetings with the authorities, both here in Brussels and in Addis, where we discuss all issues of concern. I also wanted to mention, Madam Chair, that besides these diplomatic activities, the EU or the EAS also works towards an improved human rights situation in Ethiopia through our targeted development assistance. For instance, in the 11th EDF National Indicative Programme for Ethiopia, we have foreseen €52 million for civil society and good governance to strengthen and support the democratization process in Ethiopia. And finally, Madam Chair, with regard to the case of Andargaቸው, we are in close contact with the United Kingdom authorities. We have offered them our assistance and support. I think our main concern relates to a due legal process, notably with regard to the procedure of his extradition to Ethiopia and the issue of conditions of his detentions, and also access to consular and legal support. We are, and it's obvious, we are also, of course, strongly opposed to the death penalty. The EAS will continue to follow the human rights situation in Ethiopia very closely. We will continue to raise our concerns directly with the Ethiopian authorities, and we will also react publicly if the situation requires it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias. Entiendo que...
Thank you very much indeed. You're responsible for Africa, is that correct?
Deputy Head of Division for Eastern Africa and Horn of Africa. Eastern Africa, Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. If you want me to be quite honest and open with you, which I should be, I would have preferred a bit more detail on what action will be taken by the EEAS. I understand that you're going to intervene if necessary, but we think it is necessary. I'm going to give the floor now to Ana Gomes, however.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I know Ethiopia a bit since I've been there in 2005 as head of the EU election observation mission, something that is often used by the Ethiopian government to try to disqualify me, because I decided to be genuine to what was my undertaking, was to tell the truth based on what was the observation of our 200 observers. And so, despite the fact that the affluence to the voter turnout was massive, and that people really believed in those elections, then the results, when they were counted, were clearly misguided, misconstrued, to actually counter the fact that out of Addis Ababa, 23 seats had gone to the opposition. That was not possible to hide with the later counting. Because I denounced that, as EU head of observation mission, of course, since then my statements about Ethiopia have been disqualified often by the government. But that has led me to indeed be following the situation of the people that I've met in Ethiopia. And Mr. Andegacho is exactly one of such persons. I've met him there. I've been in touch with him when he was, after being in prison, like all the other opposition leaders were in prison at that time for more than a year and a half. Then he was able to go to Britain, and I've been in touch with him, as with many others in the diaspora. And of course, I'm very worried with the situation. I will not describe anymore. This is indeed a rendition made by the government of Yemen to Ethiopia of a citizen that is as British as Ethiopian, and that is condemned to the death penalty. And I'm fearing for his life. And I believe that indeed his life has been saved because indeed there was a reaction of the international community. And even the British Foreign Office was forced to come out because, of course, I know that the British Foreign Office is well informed in Ethiopia. It has advisors placed in the Ethiopian government. I know some of them. And of course, I can't imagine that this rendition could have taken place without the British authorities knowing it full well. I'm still concerned very much for all that was said about Mr. Andegacho Tsige. His situation is untenable. British government and the EU have the obligation to do much more than they are doing. It's not just about issuing statements. And I know that actually, even in the discussions in Ethiopia, indeed the attitude is extremely reluctant to act, despite the fact that Ethiopia is a country that is very important in the region, that is a major partner for the EU in the Cotonou Agreement, that is a major recipient of EU development assistance, where indeed we make a difference if we want to make a difference. Unfortunately, some member states don't want to make a difference. They want business as usual. They are probably even supplying the filters for blocking the bloggers and so on. When I was last time in Ethiopia, it was last year, with the ACP Joint Parliamentary Assembly, the government of Ethiopia allowed me to go in with the Joint Parliamentary Assembly, and I had very interesting contacts, including with members of the government, who actually asked me to pass messages to the opposition with a view to prepare the elections that are coming in May. I did that, but I also told very clearly the authorities there's no way the opposition will come from the diaspora to, indeed, some meaningful elections if, indeed, basic elements for democracy and for free elections are simply not there. And as we have heard, with the repression that goes on, even more severe, on bloggers, on journalists, on human rights activists, this simply cannot happen. And I hope that the EU will take consequences and will not again, because after 2005, the EU sent an election observation mission that again was not even able to deliver the report headed by our colleague, Dutch colleague, and Thijs Berman, and so this cannot go on. When we were there, we were particularly concerned with two journalists, Mr. Eskinder Nega, who received the PEN Award in the United States, and a young journalist, Rayot Alemo, who was, and he's with cancer, bleeding cancer. And some of our members insisted that the co-chairs of the ACP would go and visit prison. And they did go, Mr. Louis Michel, our colleague Louis Michel, and another. But it was quite worrying what they reported. They were shown the facilities of the Kaliti prison. By the way, the Kaliti prison was where the other delegation led by Barbara Lochbihler in July had not been able to visit, despite the fact that they had the green light from the president. Then they were turned out. But when these co-chairs of the ACP visited, they reported afterwards that everything was fine, that they even have, the prisoners even had access to internet. Weird, because we in the hotels did not have access to internet. How could people that are blamed as terrorists have access to internet in the jail? So it's really very worrying, the situation, and I believe the EU has tremendous responsibility for not acting more strongly in a government with which it ought to have influence in making sure that our obligations in the framework of the Cotonou Agreement are not lived for. I would just add, I was appalled and I criticized at that time, because during this ACP Joint Parliamentary Assembly, I actually asked Commissioner Peebles and the then presidency of the EU, headed by a Vice Minister of Lithuania, to actually say if they would agree with the representative of Ethiopia in that same assembly, who was claiming that there are no political prisoners in Ethiopian jails, just terrorists. And unfortunately, nor Mr. Ibos, nor Mr. something Vichute from Lithuania had the honesty, the decency to actually say that, in line with the statements that the EU has been producing with no results at all, that indeed there are political prisons in Ethiopia, and in this way Ethiopia is not fulfilling its obligations in the framework of Cotonou Agreement.
Muchas gracias, Ana.
Thank you very much, Ana Gomez. I'll give the floor to Mrs. Farah.
Hi, thank you again. I actually wanted to follow up on something Ana Gomez has just said, but also ask Mr. Howitt about the British position, because whilst they have made statements, and here quite a strong one, about the potential mistreatment and the unlawful rendition of Mr. Tsege, they are not, so far as I know, asking for his immediate and unconditional release, which is what I think is the minimum that they should be asking for consular access. And, you know, there has been an attitude, and Ms. Gomez alluded to it, of almost deference to the Ethiopians in that regard. They've got one consular visit, and they got that when they brought a little bit of force to the question. Now what we've been seeing is quiet statements and really a lack of teeth in the response. I have a letter here that we received from the government which acknowledges that the previous convictions were in absentia and raise a number of concerns. Right? He is being held, treated under, in violation of international law and Ethiopian's own, and yet the British government is not asking for him to be released. He was rendered, he was kidnapped, bundled, thrown into a plane, taken to a country. He's a British national travelling from one place to another, and he's been grabbed by a country. And you know the country, you know it well, you have influence there. I think in addition to the aid which is given, there's also a criminal justice sector master's programme that the Brits fund in Ethiopia, and that is targeted at the very individuals, defence and security forces, who are responsible for Mr. Tsege's current situation. So I would ask really how we're using our influence for good rather than the reverse.
Mr. Howitt.
It's obviously not a debate just between us, but thank you for your generosity, Chair, in allowing me. And it's in a good cause, isn't it? I think that's a very fair comment. And I think the further debate that we've heard also from my friend and colleague Ms Gomez makes quite clear that all the evidence shows that the rendition was illegal, which I think would put a very clear argument behind what you're asking for. And so I hope, again, the President, in her summing up, will agree that we can call for such a release, because if he's there illegally in the first place, then there's no legal reason for him to be held. So if the President agrees with that argument, I hope that we may write a letter both to the Ethiopians but also to the British authorities, and I hope we might get a chance to meet afterwards in private, because we haven't had a chance to meet so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rosevicius.
Chair, thank you very much. Indeed, I wish to ask, well, we see letters and statements made late July this year, but already 2 months passed since then. Can any authorities report what actions were taken in between July last days and end of September? Are there been any tries, to meet, to go, to ask for? I know, summer vacations everywhere is an important time period, but not in this case, probably. Can we be provided with any information, any actions, which fill this time period with concrete, really try, to get those responsible, to the daylight?
Tal vez quiere intervenir.
Does anyone from the European External Action Services want to take the floor on this one?
Thank you, Chair. on the election observation mission, at least on that, we can agree. We believe that the conditions for an EOM, useful EOM, are not yet there. Even if technical improvements can be made, the problems are related to political space. So we believe that in any case it's not relevant to send an EOM. On the short-term support to the electoral process, there's an ongoing discussion regarding this, but so far, again, we don't believe that it's relevant to support the current electoral process. We will, as we said, through the 11th EDF, be funding institutions working on human rights and democracy in Ethiopia, which is a support we've had provided in the past to the Human Rights Commission, the Ombudsman, possibly the National Election Board, remains to be seen. But in any case, this will only be implemented after the May 2015 elections. It's intended to be long-term support to the democratization of Ethiopia, not specific support to these elections. There's currently a UNDP program envisaged for support to the elections. We have made clear that the proposal needs to be significantly amended, including specific activities addressing key elements aiming at improving the electoral environment, inclusiveness, transparency, but also something which has not been mentioned too much, the involvement of civil society in the democratization of Ethiopia, voter education, and so on. So these would need to happen before we would consider EU contribution, both EU and member states. Again, this is an ongoing discussion, but so far it doesn't appear relevant. On EU action regarding these arrests, of course we can't say in these meetings what we do say in bilateral meetings with the Ethiopian authorities. I can at least assure you that we do raise these issues in a quite frank way. We get also frank responses by our partners, but we do raise these issues up to Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs level. It is the main focus of our discussion in the past months. But of course we will continue to talk to Ethiopia on matters of international peace and security, for instance. We will continue to support IGAD efforts in South Sudan and so on and so forth, and which is also why we want to maintain a dialogue with the authorities. Our statements are mostly intended to say publicly what we usually say diplomatically. They are also intended to raise awareness of the general public on the situation. So we believe that there's still an important part of our diplomatic relations and our bilateral relations with the countries. And on the case of Andagashu he's, as you said rightly, he's a British citizen. So we will continue to support the UK position and ask, whatever they need from us, they will get. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. La situación.
Thank you very much. So the situation is the following. When we convened this meeting, we spoke to the British government representatives and to the European Commission, of course. From the British government, we received the statement that you all have in your files, and you've heard the information that has been given us by representatives of the EEAS. I think that we need now to ensure there is appropriate follow-up of what is discussed here. So perhaps as part of that follow-up, we could agree that we will meet once again, let's say in 2 months' time, to review the situation in relation to Ethiopia. And perhaps in 2 months' time, at a follow-up meeting, we can see or hear more detailed information on the situation in that country, in particular the situation in relation to those that are detained that we have mentioned today. We're not going to discuss Ethiopia and what is happening with these people only today, but we have this is a continuous process. We have to follow up what is discussed here today and what is going on. I'm going to discuss this, of course, with the enlarged bureau of this subcommittee, but in principle, we could meet once again in 2 months' time to discuss Ethiopia once again, and in particular, the case of those people that are detained that we've discussed today. We have a representative, too, of the Ethiopian embassy. You can take the floor if you wish.
Honorable Chair, I thank you for giving me the floor to comment on the points raised by honorable members of the Human Rights Subcommittee. The Constitution of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia provides for freedom of press since 1995. There have been a very positive and encouraging development in the print out and visual audio medias in Ethiopia. There are hundreds of private, public, daily, weeklies, magazines in the country. The media in Ethiopia is a very young industry and has a serious shortcoming and limited capacity to deliver on what the professional demand, ethics and integrity, and investigative and factual information. The government has been working with actors in the industry to build their capacity and foster professionalism regarding the recent arrests of journalists and bloggers. It has nothing to do with their professional, but due to alleged involvement, interest activities, their case like any other criminal. On a political space for opposition, the political space for all citizens of Ethiopia on a group or individual basis is granted by a constitution. Nobody can narrow or widen the space. If there are administrative actions negatively affecting and violating this provision, and if there is proved by a credible evidence the culprit be a civil or law enforcing agent, will be accountable and can be taken to court of law. The structural problem with opposition political parties in Ethiopia is lack of alternative politicals and failure to win the trust and the support of the public. If one cannot generate and mobilize the support of the win the heart of the minds of the people by playing blame antagonism, the party in power cannot be continued as lack of political space. Members of the leaders of political parties are also subject to rule of law. Belonging to any party does exonerate from accountability. This is exactly what happens to the violent prisoners, journalists and bloggers, and the government cannot make any exception by undermining constitutional provision that everyone is equal in front of the law. The government arrested them because it has credible information and evidence that they have violated and engaged in criminal activities by working with terrorist organizations. On the extradition of Mr. Andargacho, Mr. Andargacho is the Secretary General of an outlawed organization called Gimbo 7. He is a British citizen. He is on a public record stating that he has been training army group in Eritrea with the aim of overthrowing constitutionally elected government and disrupt constitutional order. His organization recently declared it disrupt all government activities inside and outside the country. That is a crime of highest order, not only for violating the Ethiopian constitution and attempting to create instability and disorder in Ethiopia, but also under a British law. While he was traveling to Asmara for the same conspiracy activity, he was arrested by the many security agents in Sana airport and was extradited to Ethiopia as per extradition treaty between the two countries. There is nothing illegal in this issue. On the basis of Vienna Convention, at the request of the British government, a consular access was provided. He also appeared on TV on his own will, and he has been handled the House of Court with rightful respect. He was convicted by the court of law. The implementing of the verdict is object to the decisions of the head of state. Meanwhile, he is under the custody of the House of Correction, with all his rights and custody are respected. Respecting for human rights and democratic rights are essential issues for managing our diversity, and we embrace it because it is the right thing to do, and our people are also deserve it. Democracy cannot thrive contradiction in terms of democracy. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, representative of the embassy. Does anybody wish to take the floor before we conclude? Any additional comments or questions? This appears not to be the case. Very well then. We will hold a follow-up meeting to this in a couple of months. Thank you very much for your contributions.